This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are going to talk about your story's premise, specifically how you as a writer can develop a premise that will function as a springboard for crafting your story. So this actually came out of a conversation we were having about character development. And in my book, Storyworks Guide to Writing Character, I talk about what before who. You need to understand your protagonist's role in your story in order to figure out who your character needs to be, right? You're going to have a plot. That character is going to have to fulfill lots of actions, react to lots of things within that plot. So part and parcel with character development is having at least a solid premise for your story. And the good news is this premise can be bare bones and still function as a springboard. So, Kathryn, I know you were just sharing some thoughts with us. Do you want to lead us into this or ask a question? So I don't monologue for 20 minutes.
I think the question would be, how elaborate of a premise do you normally start with? Like, are you talking a sentence? Are you talking a couple sentences?
Right.
A little bit of journaling? Like, what do we normally start with?
Yes, all of that is great. So as you figure out your story's premise, journaling is always a great way to start getting ideas on the page and forming those thoughts, those concepts into something structured. And you should be able to distill your premise down into a sentence. 2 or 3 is fine. If you go off the deep end, you're going to be building a synopsis instead of a premise. So that's not a bad thing. But we're really talking about what's our minimum that we need to start writing. So you need to know what your protagonist is, that what before who piece. You need to know who or what your antagonistic force is going to be, whether that's a black cat villain or something like a family tragedy that's more conceptual or amorphous. You're going to have a sense of your setting. Is it science fiction, historical, contemporary? And, just putting those elements together in a very basic way will let you launch the developmental process for your writing. So, the example with the first Skog Hall book is a newly divorced woman moves to a rural town and buys a haunted farmhouse. So I've got a touch of the backstory there. She's alone. She doesn't have a partner in tow. There's no, husband, by her side to help her confront this thing. It's a new town. So she doesn't have friends and family. She's starting over somewhere. She doesn't know anyone. Nobody knows her. It's rural. So resources are going to be farther away than she's used to. She just happens to have lived in a city before this. So stuff is not just on hand. And also, cell phones aren't as reliable. Happens to live in bluff country, so they bounce around a lot. So just knowing those details. I didn't say what part of the country, just that it's rural. I didn't say, where she came from or why she got a divorce or all of that stuff I can figure out later. And then the antagonistic force, it's a haunted house. All right. Rural house, enclosed setting. The house is the primary center of action here. And I need a ghost. Well, what is a ghost? Somebody who died tragically, unexpectedly, traumatically, right? So, okay, I'm going to have to figure out what that trauma or tragedy is that led to this person becoming a ghost. Well, the ghost isn't at peace. The ghost is haunting. So now I need to figure out what the ghost wants from Jess, why this ghost is not at peace. So just that very simple sentence with a few key elements, that's the springboard. Now I've got a handle on what I need to discover as I do my development.
I think there's a fear in starting to develop a character or starting to develop this premise that when you establish that one sentence or idea that it's done. Like you can't vary from that. And once you start building a character that fits that premise, like that's the only thing that works. Yeah, that was the end of my statement there. There's a fear.
There's a fear that you get locked into that premise.
Yeah.
Well,
exactly.
Sure, but the beauty of being a writer is that until your book is published and in the hands of the world, you can change anything at any point.
Right. But would you say that like in your experience, do you ever like limit yourself because of what you've established in your premise? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I guess would be two questions there. Do writers limit themselves based on what they've already established in the premise?
No.
Okay.
No, I think if you're limiting yourself, it's a failure of imagination or it's fear. Like one writer said he felt his premise was cliche sounding, and that made him fearful that it wasn't good enough and that he wasn't going to write a good enough story. So then that becomes self-limiting. But the answer to that is, well, it sounds cliche because it's general. I mean, there are thousands of haunted house stories. Of course, a premise is going to sound cliche, but it's the springboard that gets you to the specific details that build a unique, fascinating, compelling story. So don't worry if your premise seems flat or cliche or trite, because it's just that nutshell, bare bones version of, what do I need to work with here? Protagonist, antagonist, world, I
actually think it probably should sound fairly cliched, because that means you've boiled it down to some essentials.
Yeah.
And if you look at things like Harry Potter, when an orphan boy goes to a magic school to learn how to defeat the world's greatest foe, okay, that sounds great. But look at how well it did. So I think sometimes those I just looked this up while you were talking as well. There's a really good thing from Robert McKee called the controlling idea, and he has a format for it as well for people who like formats. So it's when such and such happens, then this and then that. So, when a flawed heroine learns to be less fiercely independent, she'll gather the team she needs to win the war. Right. So it's very generic. It's very kind of cliche to get. But now I know that, okay, that's the sense of the overall direction of my story. And it stops you from getting lost in the weeds in the pantsing parts when you're sort of drifting from your outline, or if you don't use outlines at all, when you're sort of writing yourself into a corner and think, why is this happening? Oh, hang on a minute, what was my controlling idea? Right, I've veered away from that. That's why I'm struggling with this. Well, do I need a new controlling idea? Have I come up with a better story? But I do like that. Sometimes that's good for revision. You come back to it and say, what was the controlling idea of this draft? Is it what I set out to do? Sometimes it's not, and that's great because you might find something else, and then, all right, now I know what to edit to or revise to. So I'll give you the link anyway for it, because I found the video of him talking about it.
Cool. Great. Yeah, I'll get that in the show notes. I think that's interesting because that gives you a very short but very clear beginning, middle, end. Like Correct. You know exactly what you're starting with, what they're going through, and then the end without even having to elaborate what that is. And like you're talking about, the premise comes before you start developing your character. You know what kind of character has to be developed now just based on that very small snippet.
Right, and that's why the what before the who is so important. We need, just by knowing what kind of antagonistic force our protagonist is going to encounter, we get a handle on certain qualities or traits that hero will need to have, like courage, resiliency. If you're writing a techno thriller, technology skills, or a pirate adventure, sailing skills, or so. As soon as you get just those bare bones down, it truly is a springboard. Things just start spinning off of that automatically. And then you know what you have to work with. So, if your character has to be a sailor, well, where did that come from? Did he grow up in, a Nantucket fishing family, or did he join the Navy when he turned 18? Yeah. Or so then those are the things you figure out as you do your character development, kind of the whys and the wherefores that build those traits into your character.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think the premises are great because they really do, and I wouldn't necessarily struggle to get it right, but it's a good thing to have sort of floating around in your head. But I wouldn't let it stop me from starting my first draft. Right. I think, obviously, let me backtrack. You need a premise, obviously, to begin writing. Right. But I wouldn't be thinking, oh, this sounds really tried. Should I really start this? That's probably at which point, Alida's idea of journaling, or maybe expanding it to some paragraphs, or, writing it through. So what happens, this, then that, then this, then that, and expanding that one sentence. And sometimes you might find that you do some journaling first, and then you boil it back down into the sort of overall controlling idea. So I think there's many ways to come at it.
Well, the beauty of the premise is that it functions as that springboard, and it really doesn't have to do anything else. Everything else you layer on top of it. Everything else grows out of that. But if you're going to sit down and stare at a blank page, don't have a premise. Sit there and say, what am I going to write? I don't know. What am I going to write? I don't know. But if you say, oh, I want to write an action adventure story. Okay, I need a hero who's going to be, fit this kind of plot. I need a setting. What kind of setting makes me happy? Is it the pirate adventure? Is it the spaceship adventure? Is it the urban detective adventure? So just pinning down a few details, like protagonist, antagonist, and world in the most general sense of that will be enough to get you generating.
Yeah. I like how you said that. What do I want to write? Oh, I want to write an action adventure, and you light up, right?
Yeah.
That is what I so much love about writing is you can literally just say, what do I want to write today? Ooh, I know.
Right.
This sounds so
it's
fun.
Romantic Tragedy Tuesday.
Right. Yeah. And it doesn't matter, like you said, it doesn't matter at that premise level how cliche it is. I want to write the same fantasy I just read. And that, because it was so fun. And then you will end up with a completely different story. But premise-wise, you can really get in there and just be like, this excites me. This is where my passion is. This is going to be fun.
Right. So. Absolutely. Well, other thoughts on the premise, guys?
There we go. We all agree.
I know.
We all agree. Get your premise. So how long does it take you guys to come up with your own premises? How long, journaling-wise, idea generation-wise, before you have a premise that you can start spinning into a character or a plot?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Yeah.
Mine's pretty quick as well. And I actually think that's a genuine writer's problem, is that you have too many of them, and it can be a bit of look, a squirrel. That it can be that sort of thing. So that's when a notebook, some method of recording things is handy.
Right. That's the creativity journal. Just jot down those ideas so they don't evaporate, and then. I find the ones that stick in my head are the ones worth writing, but I've got a journal full of stuff that I'll probably never write, but it's that, there's an idea. Okay, that's really exciting. And if I'm in the middle of a project and I can't start that right away, I know it's not lost. It's in the journal. And if I never come back to it, it'll only be because something else was more exciting. So
It's a good question too, Kathy, because I think if I think about it, I don't necessarily think, I must write a story about an army colonel who, as an amputee and led his battalion from a wheelchair. It doesn't. Usually it happens from a scene. There's sort of, something strikes you, what if somebody was doing this? And I think that's the difficulty for some beginning authors, is that your scene is not your premise. Mm-hmm. It might contain a kernel of it, but it's a flash of inspiration. And we used to do this in business. People, we come up with these ideas, and sometimes all an idea is just marketing. Oh, why don't they make those plates in red? That's a great idea. And well, yes, but if I went and launched a business on that, it's very easy for the competition to say, that's a good idea. Let's make all ours in red as well. So there's no real differentiation, and it's the idea is not the execution. So the idea of the scene is not the execution of the premise. It might take some then distilling down. So you might get a flash in a couple of minutes, and then the next day you think, oh, I know what this is about. And that's when your premise comes.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Robert. There is a distinction to be made between where do story ideas come from? And I think we've done an episode on that at some point, Kathryn. And the premise of your story, because inspiration can be many different things like that. Flash of a scene or notion of a character. But then before you can actually write the story, you have to have a sense of where this starts and where this leads. So is that character, if it's the character, okay, great, I've got this character. Where is this character? And what force or problem is this character going to face? And there's your premise. Once you get a handle on those three things, you can put those into a sentence or two that define the premise of your story. And then that's when you start figuring out the world, the character traits, the foe, all the rest of it. The supporting characters start populating things. And it's very much a layering process, and it gets more refined as you go. Yeah. I like the word springboard. I think you used it first, Kathryn. I think we need to just attach that to the word premise. Your premise is your springboard.
Springboard.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I feel like this is a shortish episode because, it's that bare bones nutshell topic.
That's right. We're launching you into we're springboarding you into generating your own premises.
Yes. Go forth and create premises. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.